Hello and welcome to SimCast, the higher education simulation podcast. My name's Tony Jeremy. I'm the academic lead for simulation-based education at UEA Norwich.
Hello everyone and welcome back to SimCast. My name's Lawrence Hill and I chair the simulation group in the School of Health Sciences at UEA Norwich. Very warm welcome back.
And today we are joined by Dr Jordan Tsigarides.
Hi everyone.
I had palpitations then. I wanted to get your
you did
surname.
Well. Jordan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. And I'm really excited to talk about something that's very passionate about today, virtual reality.
Fantastic. So Jordan is in fact a medical doctor and rheumatologist by background, a PhD fellow in virtual reality at UEA, and the chief medical officer for a medtech company called Revolve Labs, who in fact part-fund your PhD, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a doctor by training, but then in the last sort of 5 to 6 years, I've been working in VR space, both in education and in therapeutics. And actually, we'll talk about my PhD maybe later, but it's in therapeutics with methodology that can be applied to education.
And today we're going to be talking a lot about the work that you've been doing around virtual reality and simulation. And I guess for someone, a couple of old Luddites like us, you very much, you strike us as being on the sort of leading edge of what's going on with virtual reality and simulation now. So we're really interested to dive into it a little bit more and maybe
get rid of some of the skepticism that I still hold, and we'll talk through some of the evidence and your research and everything that you're doing in between. So Jordan, very warm welcome to SimCast.
Great, thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed the episode, please give us a like. Equally so, if you didn't like the episode, give us a dislike, but let us know in the comments why, because we're always keen to improve. To keep up to date with all things Sim, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to check the notification bell, and SimCast is available on all popular streaming platforms. Let's dive in then.
Yeah, let's dive in. Before we get into the meat of talking about VR, Jordan, could you just tell us a little bit? We love to ask guests just why do you do what you do?
So I think I've always been interested in technology. You know, I remember when I was young and my dad brought home his massive Dell laptop, and I played solitaire on it, and, growing up with gaming and, when I was young, it was the Mega Drive. Well, yes. I give lectures these days and I ask them what a Mega Drive looks like, and nobody knows what it is. Yeah, exactly. And you show them dial-up and they're like, what is this noise you're producing? And ruining my eardrums. But yeah, I went through the 90s in which there was a huge evolution in technology, both in gaming technology, your phones, everything. It all completely blew up. And so I was always interested in technology. And in particular, when I was at medical school, there was a bit of an evolution in virtual reality and the technological capabilities of virtual reality. And I'd always thought to myself, how could this be applied? I was always interested in medical education. How could this technology, immersing someone in a virtual world, I could see the possibilities, and I always thought, how could this be applied to education to improve the education of medical students, doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals, throughout the spectrum. So when I did my Master's in Clinical Education in 2017, I wanted to do a project on VR. So at that time, we were really early on in the sort of curve, the modern curve. So there was some 360 video cameras available, but they were really early, and some VR headsets, but they were really expensive, and again, really early. Yeah. So I decided to do a project on simulation orientation and using virtual reality to orientate people to SimMan and the simulation environment. And we did a 3-arm randomized controlled feasibility study comparing VR with desktop-based comparators compared to sort of normal practice and looked at outcomes there. And that really was the start of my journey with VR. From then, I did a whole host of other projects. So we created a load of content for PBL in Norwich Medical School.
Problem-based learning?
Yes, problem-based learning, yeah. So using it as trigger material instead of written cases. Yeah. And then I did a whole host of things for Health Education England and other hospitals across the region.
Yeah, I think it was around about 2017 when we first met, and our paths have crossed several times as you've been trying to integrate technology into those areas as well. I remember you doing something around a WHO checklist in theatres.
That's right. Yeah, and obviously you showed me your amazing sort of cave-like space with projection.
Yeah, the immersive classroom. Yeah,
exactly. And so we created some content around the WHO checklist to try and improve the understanding of the human factors elements involved in a good and a bad WHO checklist, which is sort of comparison. It was very early on. That was one of the second or third videos that I did. And sort of as time's gone on, we've done stuff in surgical practice, medical education and also non-clinical work, such as conflict resolution and human factors training.
Fantastic.
Fascinating stuff.
Brilliant. So you kindly came along today and actually brought some stuff for Tony and I to have a little look at and a demo and a play with. And I think it's really difficult for me to sustain this skeptical outlook about it.
You're trying,
I'm trying really
You're trying
hard.
to be a grumpy old man.
But I'm finding it harder and harder. And I think it's partly that there's just something really immersive about wearing the virtual reality headset.
So you kindly brought a couple of programs for us to have a look at.
Yeah.
So we put the headsets on. We've had a go ourselves. We've actually taken some footage of that. So we'll put that as like a bonus video on the channel that you can have a look at. See our experiences of fumbling through virtual reality for probably one of the first times for me. I don't know about yourself so much.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've had a bit of a play. Like I've had a bit of a go on my my cousin's Oculus, and I've played games on there, and I knew I liked it.
Yeah.
But I think I've remained a little bit skeptical about the value of virtual reality for creating real world competence, and I think that's where my reservation has been. And I know that you've done some previous research in this space, right? So, what does the evidence say about the role of VR in achieving learning outcomes?
So I'm going to give you a bit of a background on the evidence with a caveat.
Okay.
Yeah, my approach to VR is the same as it is to other educational modalities. The quality of the content it will influence the outcomes, and if you produce rubbish VR content, you get rubbish outcomes. So that's one thing to say. And so there are multiple systematic reviews now. One from Cure et al., I think from 2019, and a variety of others since within healthcare education practice, that have demonstrated improved learning outcomes with virtual reality compared to e-learning and traditional methods. Now, obviously, there's a lot of heterogeneity in those study designs. You know, some of them use simulation as a benchmark. Some of them used lecture-based content. You know, and the studies vary in the content that they delivered. So that's what I mean by when I say things have to be taken with a pinch of salt. But there are multiple studies now that have demonstrated improvements in learning gain with virtual reality over traditional methods, and improvements certainly in practical skills. So there was an interesting study that was conducted in part with a company called Osso VR in the US that looked at, it was a randomized controlled study essentially where they used, one group used VR as a way of doing a specific part of an orthopedic procedure, I think it was, or preparing a device, for example. And then they had another group which had a sort of more conventional, practical explanation of the content. And they found that the VR group were able to do the task more quickly and more effectively than the non-VR group. So we can link perhaps some of these studies in the text for people to read later on. There's a really interesting video which actually shows the two side by side, which is quite exciting for those VR enthusiasts. Like I said, these things have to be taken with a pinch of salt. I believe that VR has great potential, and what I like to see VR as is looking at its characteristics and what it can give us that we either can't achieve at the moment or actually lifts simulation to a different level.
And where do you see them? What are those then? Sorry, I've just butted in.
No, you've made a habit of it, you know, in a career. So
well, stop now.
Crack on.
So what do you see that those are? Where are those key areas that VR can augment the current kind of, what the word is, supply, for want of a better word, of learning modalities?
So I think on a higher level, it's around scalability of simulation. So as you know, as you know, simulation facilitators that do this all the time, you know, having the space, having the staff, and being able to produce a simulation for the masses that is reproducible is challenging. And so VR, in my perspective, provides a scalable option to enhance our access to simulation. And that's the first thing I'd say.
I suppose if people watching immediately are going to say, well, what's the cost involved with that then? So we can definitely scale things up, but is it affordable yet? Is it still outside of some institutions' reach when we're thinking about numbers?
Yeah, so I think to answer that question, maybe I need to give a bit of context about the different types of VR that are available.
Yeah,
so
please do.
You have things like computer-generated VR, and I know you had one of the educational leads for UBSIM on the podcast a few
Christine
episodes
Vogel,
ago. Yeah, and so she was talking about a computer-generated virtual reality experience that's completely coded, and essentially you can interact with a virtual human. there's a bit of an uncanny valley element to that. And I don't know if you've ever tried it, but it feels not quite right. You know that thing in front of you is not human, and it's a bit strange.
But I guess that's a bit like Sim Man, right?
Well, true, yeah. True. But I guess, there's an element that fidelity is important, and trying to replicate realistic patients or individuals that you're conversing with is important, especially when you're doing things like human factors training or when you're doing sort of emotional conversations. So the computer-generated stuff is, what I would say is, it's less accessible because it's usually driven by companies, and there's obviously a cost associated with its use, often a license process. And for NHS organisations and university, it's often unaffordable, and that limits its uptake.
When we've spoken with companies in the past, they often will do it on a pay per go basis, and we've got 1,000 students in. Wow. So we want to make it accessible to everyone. The money certainly ramps up quite quickly.
Absolutely. And so the other end of the spectrum of VR content is 360-degree video. And what that is, and sometimes people say that isn't VR, and I think that's a bit of a superficial way to look at it, but it's where you film an environment or a space using a 360-degree camera, and then basically the camera films everything around it, not just one perspective. And then when you bring it into virtual reality, you can look around the scene in the position the camera was placed. So by cleverly putting the camera in certain positions, you can take the perspective of patients. You can be a fly on the wall when there's a scenario unfolding. The challenge is that it's passive. So you can look around, but you can't necessarily make decisions and have sort of actions that have the effect. Then there's something in the middle. And this is what you tried earlier with the conflict resolution, someone shouting at you and you making decisions. And so it gave you the option to see a piece of a scenario unfold and then think about that scenario and think, what would I do in this situation? How would I respond?
So for those people listening, we're put into a scenario where we play the role of a GP receptionist.
That's right.
And we can have different patients come up to us. One was an angry patient, one was anxious, and one was entitled.
Yeah.
And you're in that first person perspective of what's going on. You've got a patient that presents yourself with a scenario, and then you go through 3 options, and it can go down different pathways depending what you do. And we were both good and bad at answering questions.
Yeah. I think for me, the thing that sort of struck me was that it made me feel genuinely uncomfortable when this guy started shouting at me.
Yeah.
Enough, I think, to anchor it as a concrete experience. Like, if someone had shouted at me like the guy in the video did, and I was there in person, there would have been a whole lot of other adrenergic,
physiological
responses that I didn't have, but I definitely felt uncomfortable.
But we also talked about this just before the podcast. Actually, if you were trying to do that in sim, you'd have to have an actor. I think if you had other learners playing the role, they would probably start laughing. And I think if you were let's say, what we often do to keep costs down is we have academic faculty playing that role. I think you've got a whole new challenge then with you being that abrasive to a learner in front of you. So
I think it's about, the psychological safety of that simulation, but also the psychological safety of those learners then thereafter that simulation, where they want to come to you, but you were that angry guy or woman who shouted at me in a simulation, and that's a real experience in the real world that you don't really want students carrying after that.
But I think the two complement each other, don't they?
Definitely.
If you have one without the other, you have this kind of risky area. Whereas if I personally would put that VR experience as partly maybe after skills and isolation or part task training, then the VR, then maybe leading into that full blown sim.
Yeah. I definitely feel like I've been shouted at today. I definitely have that. And I think for that reason, the concrete experience is sufficient for us to then have a conversation in debrief about, to go to sort of cycle round Kolb's experiential learning cycle. And okay, so what do we draw from that? What was the experience of it like? Can we conceptualize this into other ways? Can we think about this in terms of how this might influence your future practice?
Absolutely. And just drawing back on the research again, so there's a really interesting study again from the US that we can link in that looked at the physiological responses that you get from VR and whether they can be comparable with a real experience. And that study looked at a pediatric ALS type scenario, and doing it in VR, and then also following residents and tracking their physiological metrics when they were in a real shift and had to undertake pediatric ALS. And although they weren't exactly comparable, the people in the VR group got a physiological response. Their heart rate changed, their blood pressure changed. They had changes in cortisol levels, I believe. And so, as you were saying, it comes back to what you said. You feel like you've been shouted at. You feel like you've had a physiological response. Maybe not to the level you would in real life, but from a scalability perspective, the ability to allow people to have that experience and have what it sort of feels like, I think is hugely valuable.
So they've engaged in a fiction contract, and it's physiologically, you can see it physiologically.
Yeah,
they've engaged in that fiction contract. Yeah. Interesting.
And I wonder if I could just mention, obviously, just coming back to those three different types of VR that I mentioned. 360 cameras these days are pretty cheap. You can get them for a few £100, and a lot of universities have them. So people are starting to create their own content. Then adding some interactivity on top has an extra challenge level, but it's achievable. It's something that you could do, especially if you have someone like a simulation technician in an organization. So you can start to create your own content, which is relevant for your learning outcomes. The other problem with computer-generated options is that they're often generic because they're trying to obviously promote multiple countries and institutions. So it's accessible in the respect that those sort of 360 video and hybrid 360 video options are available to you and something you could start doing yourself. The computer-generated stuff is available, but it has its cost implications. And then you have to think about the cost-benefit analysis compared to what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah. I think just what struck me, about something you said earlier, and I think it's absolutely on the note. It's right on the money. Is that it's all about the content. Like you can create your own content and make that content relevant to your learner group. It's all about what that simulation, whether it's VR or in person, sets out to achieve in terms of the learning outcomes.
Yeah. And I think, again, we had a conversation that our hesitation we did an episode recently about our gripes about simulation. And one of the gripes is that simulation is seen as a panacea to fix everything. And I guess our hesitation is virtual reality, is the use of AI and simulation. Is this the new panacea? Have we just moved the goalposts? And it is all about the content, isn't it? Because if you're doing simulation for simulation's sake and you're not writing your learning outcomes around it, it's a bit of a pointless experience. The same thing if you're just using VR because it's a new bit of kit that you want to just trial.
Totally. And the problem with new technologies is they're often, you get tech enthusiasts who say, this is the next big thing. Like, we need to put this everywhere. This needs to be everything that we do now. Forget the old stuff. Why do you need face-to-face simulation when you've got VR, And that's the wrong approach. I think sensible people understand it's part of the toolkit. It's one of the ways you can deliver immersive simulations. And perhaps, as you said, it may precede a face-to-face simulation. It may prepare people for a face-to-face simulation. In some contexts, when simulation just isn't available, it may provide access to a simulation experience, which may not be quite as good as the real thing or may have its limitations. But nevertheless, it allows them to have that experience, as you said, and you can start to apply the learning pedagogy around that. And I was saying, this all comes back to what are the characteristics of VR that are important and that I think are valuable. Well, first is immersion and being able to be situated within an environment that you may not be able to actually achieve in simulation or in real life. So that comes back to situated learning theory, of course, right? So, for example, being able to film a procedure which you just cannot get access to as a student and being able to then see that in a virtual reality environment. Yeah. So, for example, we did a project on Hodgkin's lymphoma where you followed the journey of a patient with a lump in their armpit through their initial consultation with a GP, through to the histopathology department, the pathology department where their blood test's been sent, through to them having a lymph node biopsy, and you saw the procedure with a real patient. And then you saw the histopathology aspect and learned about the biopsy. Then you saw the PET scan with the radiologist who talked you through it all. Yeah. And then finally you saw the hematologist at the end. So it gives you the opportunity to see the whole journey in a realistic, immersive way. And, learning as a medical student, and I'm sure it's the same for your students, you get a cross-sectional view of what a patient's journey looks like. Yeah. And often it's really difficult to put it all together. So, one of the projects we've done previously is home visits, understanding what home visits look like for GPs and how you do them effectively, how you manage that environment, which is very alien and often difficult to actually provide patient care in. And so doing that in VR means that we can take people into difficult spaces. It might be, someone lives in a shared house somewhere, or they're a hoarder, or they live on a narrowboat, or they're homeless and don't have a fixed abode. How do you manage that as a paramedic, or as a district nurse, or as a doctor? So I think being able to immerse someone in spaces it's really difficult to in real life is a real benefit of VR. And then overlaying the interactivity elements, gamified learning approaches is obviously very valuable can be very valuable in VR. And then putting it in a sort of larger package of learning that most likely includes face-to-face.
And to be honest with you, they're the same goals we're trying to achieve with, quotes, conventional simulation as well. So, we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, aren't we? Just using different modalities to do so.
Yeah. Another tool, and a highly adaptable tool, albeit expensive tool in some cases, but a highly adaptable tool.
Maybe, but
in the educator's toolbox.
I want to come back to this concept of where we are on the learning curve, because I think there's some really interesting things that might develop with VR moving forward. But also that conceptualization. So we talked about concrete experiences. When people who are regular to the podcast will know we're big advocates of Kolb's experiential cycle, but using VR to get that concept, that idea of some areas of learning is really, really powerful. I was literally inside a colon earlier.
You were, yeah.
So for those, particularly for those visual learners, so I maybe need to put some context around that. You showed us a demo of a stapling device used for anastomosis in colorectal surgery, and I watched the video, and it put me inside the colon. I don't think I've ever seen or learnt about it in that way before. So that is a...
And then the medical device as well. That medical device, you were kind of almost flying around this medical device in this sort of it's hugely macro scale. And I can't think of a way of doing abstract conceptualization.
Exactly.
You can't. That's not something that you can do in the real world.
And you were talking about surgical site infection. So again, trying to get particularly first year learners. So this is something I do with my ODP students. I teach them about healthcare acquired infections and surgical site infections very early on, because it's so important about everything that we do. But to get them to understand at a microbiology level what's happening, being able to experience it in VR is hugely,
what's been great is that you came here with skepticism, and now you're telling me,
Jordan, you need to do this.
I really like this. This is great.
I told you it was going to be difficult to sustain it. So look, that some of the stuff that we've looked at that you've kindly brought and you've shared with us is kind of relates to your chief medical officer role in the company that you work for. Can you tell us a little bit about Revolve Labs and your role there and what you do?
Yeah, so I met the CEO of Revolve Labs, Hamish, about 4 or 5 years ago. We met just by chance, actually. It was a mutual connection who put us together, because his background is as a teacher. So he was doing a bit of VR at that point, but not a huge amount. And he was doing things like improving access to surgical training across seas. So he did a project in the Caribbean using a sort of Teams architecture infrastructure to try and teach Caribbean surgeons how to do a certain technique and that kind of things. And so he saw that I was doing VR work at Norwich Medical School and doing, creating these 360 simulated experiences. And so we got talking, and you know what it's like when you connect with someone, especially when it feels entirely genuine, because from his perspective, he came from an educational background. And as clinicians, we're sort of like, we come at it from another angle, don't we? We teach, and we sort of learn how to teach. And I did a master's in it and stuff, but their whole thing is teaching, and their whole thing is teaching students that sometimes don't want to learn, and also working with difficult scenarios. So we started working together a few years back, and we sort of supported each other. He helped me with some of our delivery of our problem-based learning material, and sort of I supported him with some of the projects he was doing around virtual reality, and it sort of evolved from there. So we worked together on a more formalized basis, I guess. I was sort of supporting them with how to apply VR in a medical context, and not just using VR for the sake of it, but actually making sure your learning outcomes are appropriate and using, the 3D elements and the macro to micro, as you said, in its most effective way, and all sorts of different stuff. And then more recently, I got to a sort of juncture in my clinical academic career where I was looking for PhD funding. And to be totally honest with you, with the public funders, it was extremely difficult to get. mainly because funding is less available, but also when you're trying to do something at the cutting edge, it's deemed there's a lot of risk attached to it. So, I applied for 4 different PhD programs actually over 2 years and had no success. And so Hamish from Revolve said, look, we're working together. I know you want to do stuff in VR therapeutics because that's my main interest, but why don't we support you to do your PhD? And it means that, your time is less wasted. We can continue to work together and you're going to get some amazing skills out the back of it. And that's what happened. And so actually my PhD is around using eye tracking within virtual reality systems to personalize virtual reality therapeutics, which is a new form of sort of digital therapies in the context of chronic pain. But there's obviously a lot of transferability to being able to understand cognitive processes from eye tracking and applying that to simulation and virtual reality simulation in particular. So in the future, I believe that these sort of closed loop systems that take information from the user, their eye tracking data, their pupil diameter, where they're looking, that maybe their arm movement, perhaps their facial movement even. You can get facial trackers with VR these days, perhaps even their heart rate, and then puts it into it sort of feeds it into the virtual reality environment and changes and adapts the content in real time to improve the learning. I think that's the future. And one thing I'm super excited about is the fact that these VR devices are standalone now. So, like this one here is a device which can be used without a computer. A lot of them have eye tracking involved. A lot of them have other wearables that you can put into the whole system.
Haptic feedback. And,
exactly.
Well, it's like Moore's Law, isn't it? It's just getting more and more miniaturized and more affordable.
Exactly. And you can have a really high quality virtual reality experience in one of these things. And we're not too far away from being able to take your own physiological metrics and adapt the content in real time. And so you can have a truly personalized experience.
I mean, that is just amazing to think about, for the lads that were playing on the lasses that were playing on a Sega Mega Drive in the 1990s to get to the point.
Did you ever think when you were a kid that something like that would be attainable?
No, absolutely not. It's mind blowing, isn't it?
If that was on tomorrow's world, in the 90s, it would have been difficult to believe that was going to happen. So where is this project now then? Like it sounds amazing. Is this actually happening?
It's actually happening. Yeah. So the project's in a position now where we're running a research study as part of this, of course. We've got ethical approval to collect data with healthy controls and people with chronic pain. I've designed and created my own virtual reality application, which basically what it does is you do a variety of more difficult tasks. They're part of something called an MBAC, which is a psychologically validated task, which basically challenges you at different levels. And when you do the task, all of your eye tracking data is recorded simultaneously at around, so you get a data point every 10 to 11 milliseconds. That's what we're really talking high level resolution here. And you need that sort of level to be able to see changes in the eyes. And the idea is by the end of this is that we're going to have data sets that we can run through machine learning pipelines to be able to predict someone's cognitive load. So that's how much sort of mental resource that person is putting into doing a task just from their eye tracking. And the reason that you can do that is because if you think about when you've done a difficult task, well, you wouldn't know this happens, but autonomically, your pupil dilates, bringing in as much information as physically possible so that you can do the task more effectively. We can extract that pupil dilation information and we can, from it, so this is obviously the PhD's outcome, we can from it understand the person's cognitive load without them even having to provide an input to tell us it. We can do it automatically. So why is that important? Well, if you're trying to train people in high stakes environments like surgical trainees or A&E trainees, paramedics, resuscitation training, and there's lots of applications outside of medicine too. But if you're trying to train someone in that environment, you want to potentially deviate the load that you're applying. So what I mean by that is you don't want them to be underloaded as such, because that means that they'll be less motivated, engaged with the content. It'd be essentially too easy, right? You don't want to overload them because we know cognitive overload reduces your learning gain and your learning outcomes. You want to keep them in a sweet spot. And I'm not going to try and pronounce the psychologist's name who came up with the flow concept because it's worse than my surname. But it's got a C and a Z that starts with. But perhaps we can link to that. But the idea of a flow concept is when you're completely in the zone. You're completely in the zone. That is when it's thought that your learning is at its maximal, especially with this. But you may want to do something like you might want to overload someone for a short period of time so that they make a mistake on purpose. You might want to do that on purpose.
Or just so that they experience, so that you were saying for a period of 2 minutes, we exceeded your cognitive bandwidth in that simulation. Were you aware that was happening?
Yeah.
Exactly.
How did you feel at that moment what was going through your mind when this happened in the scenario?
So it will be able to adapt in real time
That's
to
the
get
idea.
you in that sweet spot.
Yeah, that's the idea. And it may be, this is still early doors, and there are very few academics and companies doing this sort of thing in the world. There's a couple that I know of, one in the UK and one in Austria. But doing it in VR is another step. A lot of people haven't applied that yet. So the idea is that perhaps at first it's some feedback. So it will measure your cognitive load and it will provide you feedback. It will say, you were cognitively underloaded in that task. And it will try to then understand why that was. It may be that you provide your own metrics to it, like, how engaged were you? How immersive did you find it? How difficult did you find it? And, if someone finds it really difficult and they weren't engaged and they weren't immersed and their cognitive load was low, then that may be some element of the environment that can be changed. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Or similarly, if they're overloaded, it may then just slow down the procedure, provide some feedback to say, look, you're cognitively overloaded, take a second, step back, and we'll give you some strategies to manage this when you're in the real world when this happens.
Wow.
From an educationalist's perspective as well, that's really interesting because you could use it as data that shows you to what extent the learning process has been effective to a certain point. When you take a cohort and you say, right, we're going to have a sample of this many go through this task, and you'd be like, oh, actually, they were finding that really difficult still. We need to do something else.
Yeah.
The other thing that occurred to me was there must need to be I don't want to say near infinite, but a huge number of different potential ways that these scenarios can change and unfold though. Yeah. So that sounds like that's a whole lot of complexity to write in.
Okay, I'm assuming this is where AI is going to come in.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it may be that there needs to be huge numbers of complexities, but it could be as simple as you're doing a simulation of a laparoscopic procedure. It's going well, and you're cognitively underloaded. So guess what happens now?
We're going to ramp up the difficulty.
Yeah. And now you have to manage your complication. Or it could be that one of the staff nurses drops one of your instruments on the floor, or the medical student who's opposite you just touches his face, and you've got to now manage the fact he is de-sterilized. And what do you do in that situation?
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we sometimes do this in simulation, don't we? We do. We try and ramp it up. So I'm thinking about, if we use something like one of our eye simulators to change the parameters.
Yeah.
We fumble around. So for AI or a VR program to just do this almost seamlessly.
Yeah. The other thing that excites me about AI is providing truly personalized experiences for the learner. So, in a sort of dystopian world where everyone's got their own VR headset, maybe we're not so far away from that, but you could have a device where you put data in and it learns from your data, and your data is going to be different from Fred's data and Betty's data. And I don't know why they've come up with those names, but you know what I mean. And over time, it actually adapts to you. So it learns that, for example, when your eye tracking changes in a certain way, that means you are cognitively overloaded, but it's probably due to the fact that your anxiety levels have gone up because of something that's happened in the environment, and you can change that slightly. And that might be different for Fred, who actually his cognitive load level goes up because he's just finding the task too difficult. It's not something that's actually adapted or influencing him from an external perspective. So cognitive load is influenced by lots of things.
Of course.
How tired you are, how stressed you are.
Intrinsic and extrinsic factors.
Yeah. And so we've seen studies now, for example, that show that if you have an expert surgeon and a junior surgeon and you get them to do the same task, the expert surgeon's cognitive load is almost like a flat line. It's very, 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 it's not very spiky if you think about a sort of a conventional graph, whereas the junior surgeons or the trainee surgeons goes up and down because they're just constantly trying to manage things that they're not familiar with. So it's trying to flatten that spikiness to get to a point where you're more of an expert. So it's going from trainee through to expertise and using this as a way of sort of directing that.
Talking of dystopia, could VR be the end of summative assessment?
Well, potentially. I was thinking similar kind of things. I was thinking in the future, and I was thinking, as an educationalist in the past, I can already see the change. If we use something as simple as laptops in a lecture theatre, that you're as a learner, you're probably one of the odd ones out if you don't have one. Whereas when I started my academic journey 10 plus years ago, very rarely you'd have one.
Yeah.
Are we in a position where we're just VR headsets in front of you now?
I have to say, so when the Apple Vision Pro came out, which is Apple's venture into VR, I put a picture up on formerly Twitter. Now, obviously, you know what it is. Which was so there was a picture of a classroom, and they all had an Apple Vision Pro in front of them because once Apple get in the game, you know what it's like with all the iPhones. It sort of changes the realm. It didn't quite turn out like that because the price point was too high at that stage. But in the near future, Google are just about to produce their own headset and market it. Apple will come back with a part 2, which will be cheaper and more affordable, or perhaps better, so people don't mind paying for it. Meta, who are owned by essentially Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, they are pouring billions into the hardware to make it cheaper. So I don't see it. I certainly see a time when everyone's going to have a VR headset, 100%. I don't see a world without that. Will it take over assessment? Well, I think, as doctors and healthcare professionals, we are competency-based, right? Our training is competency-based. You want to be confident that person can go on and do things in the real world. And so I think we are quite a long way away from replacing OSCEs and physical assessments with VR. In the future, when the technology catches up to the real world, perhaps, and it may well start to come in. And I've seen some studies and some organizations that are starting to use it as part of assessment, but I don't see it taking over for some time because I think we'll always have that concern in a way. Is this applicable? Until there are really strong studies out there that show that everything you do in VR is applicable to, which is just not going to happen because of the heterogeneity for a long time.
And you know what? You're going to meet people with a lot more resistant cynicism and skepticism than what we've managed to put up today.
We were sold quite easily, weren't we?
Yeah, it was too easy. It was like shooting fish in a barrel for you, Jordan. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for coming along.
I don't think this topic is finished, so I think we're going to have you back for a future episode, perhaps when your PhD's finished.
I'd love to come back. Yeah, it's always excited talking about this stuff. So it's great to talk about two people that were skeptical and now aren't.
So just before we finish, how much do you think it's going to ramp up? Is it going to be like, are we looking at some of these things like imminently, or?
I mean, you're talking about the sort of data-driven analytics. Yeah, I think over the next few years, you'll find that VR companies are going to, they're already starting to embed AI much more. So, I've seen these computer-generated companies starting to have AI-driven avatars. So an example is a company called Body Swaps, who do a sort of swapping of perspectives in virtual reality. I'm pretty sure that they've got an AI-based avatar you can speak to and have some sort of naturalistic response from. So it's going to come. When will we start using eye tracking technologies and data-driven technologies? I think in the next few years it will become more part and parcel of. But I think you'll still have the non-data-driven applications for some time, and it will be quite niche products and opportunities that will be marketed out there for sort of cognitive load training, for physiological response training, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think in the next few years we'll be in position. It's doable now.
Well, we're going to have you back then.
Absolutely, 100%. Dr. Jordan Tsigarides, thank you so much for coming on SimCast, and thank you very much for listening at home. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.